I want to throw like a proper question at you first. A lot of the best things about this excellent book are sort of dealing with misconceptions about Thatcher. There's a lot of things that surprise me. What do you think is the biggest misconception about Margaret Thatcher?
Well, you're right. There are a lot. And unfortunately, a lot of them have been allowed to fester over the last 35 years since she left office. It's incredible to think it is 35 years. I think the biggest one is that she was somehow in favour of apartheid and the South African regime. And I've gone to great lengths to look into that. And I've got the evidence to show that she absolutely wasn't. She was integral to apartheid being dismantled and integral to Nelson Mandela being released. But talk to any lefty and they won't realise that at all.
Well, because there's a lot of baddie stuff, isn't there? There's the pantomime villain stuff that a lot of people remember about her. It was interesting to read that even the Thatcher milk snatcher stuff, and we're seeing with Keir Starmer, if you've got a name that rhymes with stuff, you're basically fucked from the start. But even that was a sort of a continuation of the previous Labour minister from the previous government.
Yeah, and it was a Labour MP that came up with that phrase during one of the debates in the Commons. And it was actually Ted Short, who was Education Secretary under Harold Wilson before the 1970 election. He cut school milk from secondary schools. Now, after the 1970 election, when Thatcher was Education Secretary, the Treasury decided to go one step further and restrict it also, take it out of primary schools. And I was a primary school kid at that point, and when I heard this was happening, I cheered. That was the moment I became a Thatcherite, I think, although I didn't really know it, because it was disgusting stuff. It didn't have any health benefits at all, as far as I could see. But she actually resisted this and tried to fight her corner in cabinet, but the cabinet made the decision. She had to abide by collective responsibility and went out and sold it. And she had a very, very difficult time. And I think even Ted Heath felt a little bit guilty about the fact that, I mean, imagine if social media was around in that time, what she would have had. But she did implement the policy.
But what's interesting, though, is you say, imagine if social media was around, but that perception of her took root without it. And do you think it was exacerbated by sort of, not sexist, but gender presumptions that because she was a woman, and like you say, there is a different, I suppose, context to her extending this to smaller children. So she was a woman doing something evil, in inverted commas, to small children. Is that why it blew up in her face so much?
Well, I think so. I don't think anybody remembers Ted Short for withdrawing it. So I think that did play a part. I mean, if you think about it, back in those days, women in cabinet were invariably in that department. That was seen as the woman's job. And there'd been various female secretaries of state for education before that. And it wasn't really until Tony Blair's time that women actually were seen as competent enough to do other jobs as well.
I mean, you've written books about Thatcher. You've written Memories of Margaret Thatcher, a book of quotations, Thatcher in her own words. Is it safe to say that you're a fan? And if so, what do you like about her? What are her personal and political characteristics that keep you coming back?
Well, I think it's important to say for this biography that I've written, I haven't written it as a fan. I've tried to write it in a way that examines a lot of her faults, a lot of her policy failures too, because in 11 and a half years, any prime minister is going to have failures, and she certainly did. So this is not a hagiography. The point of this book is to introduce her to new generations because, as I said at the beginning, she left office 35 years ago. You have to be, I think, 56 years old to have voted for her in the 1987 election. So it's really, I mean, new generations do not want to read a 3-volume biography of Margaret Thatcher by Charles Moore, excellent though it is. And I would encourage anybody to read that. In fact, the opening paragraph in my book says, if you have read Charles Moore's biography, please stop here. This book is not for you. And it is meant as a primer. It's meant as an introduction. And if you do want to know more, then go and read other books. But, I mean, going back to your question, what do I like and respect about her? I think it was because partly she enthused people about politics. And that was how I really first got involved in the Conservative Party. in 1968, she made a speech to the Tory party conference, which obviously I don't remember, I was 5. But she said, "We don't just want your support, we want your enthusiasm." And I think there are very few politicians, certainly nowadays, who engender that feeling of enthusiasm and excitement that she did.
At last election, didn't Keir Starmer effectively do the opposite, where he sort of said, "We don't want your enthusiasm, we just want your support for a wafer-thin public mandate, which is a mile wide and an inch deep." I mean, it did stick out, that first paragraph about who you were writing it for. You said you were writing for people that weren't adults when she was in power. How do you think the Gen Zs perceive her? Because on the one hand, they're perceived as more left-wing, but on the other hand, they do like people being their authentic selves. They do like conviction. People like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Farage have developed a following on things like TikTok. So how do you think they might see her?
Well, in a sense, that's how this book came about, because you'll remember a couple of years ago that I broke my hip and I was advised to get a personal trainer to do the rehab. So I did that. Sounds very wanky, I know, but there we are. And he was 25, called Aaron, and he said, when he found out what I did for a living, he said, "Now, Margaret Thatcher, I've heard of her, but what did she do?" And I was like horrified, thinking that he didn't even know she was Prime Minister. So this book is.
But he's a personal trainer, though, mate. I mean, it kind of goes with the territory.
But he's not thick. He's actually an intelligent guy. So, in a way, this book is partly for people like him, Generation Z, who just don't know things from that era. They're not taught about that era in school. So, in a sense, why should they know? It's a bit like, I would say, if I was writing this book in 1925 as opposed to 2025, I'd be writing about Disraeli. Well, how many of my friends in that period would have known much about Disraeli? Very few of them. So I think it's important that people do get a perspective on recent politics, particularly with politicians like Thatcher, who, whether you love her or loathe her, she still has an effect on our lives today, because the Thatcherite economic settlement is still there. The trade union reforms that she brought in have not been rolled back by Labour governments, although Angela Rayner, I think, is sort of having a little go at that.
Yeah, she'd love a go. You mentioned that thing, the economic settlement. I think I've got a sense of what you mean by that, but just define that for us.
Well, the fact that we live in a free market world. I mean, governments now tend to regulate a lot more than Margaret Thatcher ever did. But we live in a free market world where most of the economy is run in the private sector. Now, clearly, there are question marks over whether all of the privatisations that she did were right to do, were successful or not. But effectively, we're still running under a sort of pseudo-Thatcherite economy. Now, I don't believe that the Thatcherism of the 1980s is necessarily appropriate for our economy, our post-COVID economy, our post-Brexit economy. But the principles that she espoused about free markets, encouraging people to be entrepreneurs, encourage risk takers, surely they still have to be at the core of our economy. Otherwise, we're not going to get this growth that the Chancellor keeps banging on about.
Well, it's interesting that you just returning slightly to younger people. I was just thinking about how she appears in fictionalized versions of herself. People always tend to like her. If you look at her in The Crown, because she was an outsider at Balmoral, you tend to think they were weird and she actually just had a job to do. She came across well in the Brian Walden thing that was on recently, to the point where apparently Steve Coogan asked for it to be re-edited because she was too likeable. She also came across well as Helen Mirren. Is that because when you look at it, she was an outsider, she was industrious, she had a lot of characteristics that if you distill them right down, people are probably going to respond quite positively to?
Yes. But I think we have to think back 50 years. It was actually 50 years ago in February that she was elected Tory party leader. And there are quite a few parallels with Kemi Badenoch, actually, about the challenges that they both face. At that time, there were only about 20 female MPs. And it was almost unthinkable that a woman could lead the Conservative Party. But she had the balls to challenge Ted Heath after he had failed. I think he'd lost 3 elections out of 4. And she was given credit for that by the Tory MPs. They voted for her in the first round just as a means of getting rid of Ted Heath. And then she won the second round too, to everybody's surprise. And I remember on that day, February the 11th, 1975, when I was, I think, 12, running upstairs to tell my grandmother, who was ill in bed, that she had won. And my grandmother burst into tears. Now, she was always known as the Queen Mother or the Duchess, so she had some regal airs about her, my grandmother, but she was also a bit of a feminist. And I asked her later, well, why did you cry at that? And she said, because I never thought I would live to see the day where a woman could lead a political party in this country. And that was emphasised, I suppose, over the 4 years of her period as leader of the opposition, where she had to convince a very sceptical nation that a woman could do the job. And the night before the 1979 election, the final Tory election broadcast was her looking straight down the camera, trying to reassure people. I mean, she actually said, I know a lot of you have some misgivings about a woman, whether a woman can do the job. Let me tell you. And then she went on to explain why she would be able to.
When Barry White level deep voice.
Yeah, quite. And
let me tell you, baby.
and I think, well, it didn't take her long to prove that a woman could do the job. I mean, sadly, the women who succeeded her as Prime Minister haven't been so successful.
How dare you? Liz Truss, mate, she was cut off in her prime. She was just getting started. Before this seems too much like a Thatcher loving, excluding the poll tax, because I think that always stands out quite clearly maybe as the thing that she got most wrong. Outside of the poll tax, what do you think she got most wrong during her time in office?
I think towards the end, she lost her touch. She really did have her finger on the pulse of the nation, particularly actually what the so-called C2s and Ds wanted, the working class vote, which she successfully cultivated in 79, 83 and 87 because of the sale of council houses. And that you can either look on as her biggest achievement, because it was the biggest transfer of wealth to the working classes that the country had ever seen. That on top of that, a lot of people bought shares in privatized companies, again, unthinkable in previous years. But after the 87 election, I think she began to get a bit imperious. Remember, we are a grandmother, that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah. She used the royal we after.
Yeah, and she just sort of, I think, thought she was omnipotent. And whenever a politician thinks like that, they get into a bit of trouble. And although, I mean, this idea that she didn't like argument or that she was a dictator, I try and dispel that a bit in the book. There were lots of Tory ministers who were scared stiff of her. I was talking to a ex-Tory MP last night who was talking about this, and he was a special advisor at the time, and he said they would literally quake in their boots before going into a meeting with her. Now, I mean, that's not particularly healthy in many ways. And if you're not willing to sort of say your piece and stand up to a prime minister, then what you're doing in the cabinet. And her big problem, I think, and this is an internal Westminster thing, but she was terrible at choosing her cabinet. And even at the end, she didn't really have a majority of support in her own cabinet. And after 11 and a half years, she really ought to have done. And she let the whips choose all of the junior ministers. And again, her choice of chief whip was very suspect. And so they kept picking what she would have described as the wets. And when she got to promote people, those were the only ones to choose from. So she wasn't very good at party management from that point of view.
I mean, is it too simple to say, in the way that with tennis, we always say, oh, you don't have any characters these days. When I used to watch Jumbo Connors and Henri Lecomte, you don't get that now. Is it too simple to say that the standard of politicians has got worse? Or are there actually mitigating factors that sort of mean that that's both true and inevitable? I suppose I should expand. The reason I say that is because they have to talk a lot more. They have to appear on a lot more things. They can't have that sort of mystique. And she felt very, in the way that rock stars used to be remote and give a few interviews a year. They just have to talk all the time. So the law of averages is they're going to say something fucking stupid at some point.
Well, cue Kemi Badenoch, because although I said she faces a lot of the same challenges as Margaret Thatcher did, she faces a media that wants her to comment on everything. I mean, Tony Blair's really at fault for this. Do you remember when he commented on the death of Samir, Deirdre Barlow's husband, in Coronation Street?
Yes.
And I thought, Christ, where do you go from there? And that's what we've got now, a 24/7 media that wants content. And if they don't get the content, they'll make the content up themselves. So, and Kemi is somebody who doesn't really like the media particularly. Margaret Thatcher never really did, but she only ever had to do 4 or 5 set-piece interviews a year with Robin Day and David Dimbleby. Whereas Kemi is at the beck and call of virtually every broadcast station on the planet. I mean, I see tonight she's doing the Matt Ford Political Party podcast live on stage. Well, I think that's the sort of thing she should be doing, but you wouldn't have ever got Margaret Thatcher doing that sort of thing.
There's a potential banana skin, I would say, because that audience, he has Tories on every so often, and they try and smile, but they tend to like the ones that voted Remain, if you know what I mean, or like the ones that sort of left the Tory party and then attacked them from outside the tent.
Rory Stewart, the Guardian's favourite Tory, for a reason.
I mean, do you sort of, when you look at somebody like Starmer, who's got such a sort of damaging lack of a cohesive vision, almost deliberately so, do you think it'd be possible for a Thatcher to emerge now? Or could anyone do 11 years in power now, do you think?
It's possible. I mean, our parliamentary arithmetic makes anything possible, frankly. I mean, look at the last election. In theory, Starmer should be there for at least 2 terms. I can't see it myself.
But we're too impatient now. Like, you know, people have already said resign straight away. Like the churn, I think rolling news accelerated it, and then social media kicked it further. That there's an impatience in politics now.
It's not just that. It's instant gratification. And you want instant validation as well. If you switched from Conservative to Labour at the last election, you want to know that you were right to do so. And at the moment, we're recording this 11 months into the Labour government. At the moment, you'd have to say that it's very difficult for anybody who switched to Labour to think, yeah, I'm really glad I made that decision. It's worked out really well.
Yeah, no, smashing it.
In so many ways.
One thing that came up in the book that I thought was interesting is the way that popular culture has romanticised elements of the miners' strike. Maybe not the miners, but the unions, right? It was. I thought it was interesting to be reminded of some of the union practices that were, like, you know, for example, doing strike action based on people holding their hands up.
Or 2 hands up.
2 hands up, and, you know, being able to be in some cases manipulated by fairly persuasive shop stewards, pickets turning up at other places that weren't related to their place of work. Is it sort of gone down in popular culture because of what's the word, the full Monty and things like that? The miners' strike was exclusively this terrible thing where the establishment beat down the oppressed and all the public were against it. My dad was a trade union man at the time, but when I asked him honestly about it, he said by the time it happened, the country were crying out for people to take on the unions.
Yes. The interesting thing is that she didn't take on the miners at the beginning. They put in a massive pay claim in 1981, so she could have had the confrontation then if she'd wanted it. But they hadn't got enough coal stocks to survive a winter. Now, at the moment, we think, what? Coal stocks surviving winter? It's a different world, because at that time, heavy industry was reliant on coal. Obviously, it no longer is. I mean, that's an interesting thing in itself, because in 1989, she became the first world leader to make a speech on climate change. So, I mean, environmentalists ought to be really grateful to Margaret Thatcher for closing down all the coal mines, but obviously they don't look at it like that.
Tell Greta that.
Yeah, quite. But no, she's in prison in Israel now, isn't she? But
I think so.
The problem is that they didn't have, they knew that they weren't ready, so they bided their time. Nigel Lawson came in as Secretary of State for Energy, and he built up the coal stock. So when the confrontation came in 1984, it wasn't at the instigation of the Conservative government, it was purely at the instigation of Arthur Scargill, the leader of the NUM. And he knew that he had to have a dispute then, because if he'd waited until later, there was a new Trade Union Act coming in which would have enforced secret ballots. Well, he knew that he wouldn't probably win a secret ballot. So he had the strike anyway at the most stupid time possible. It started at the beginning of March 1984, after the winter had finished. So the coal stocks were adequate enough for the government to take them on. And so they did. And it was a brutal dispute. I mean, there's no doubt about it. You look at some of the scenes on the picket lines, and people say, well, she used the police for political purposes. no, she used the police to protect miners who wanted to go back to work. And that's exactly, in my view, what they were there to do. Now, there were some very violent scenes. The Battle of Orgreave is the one that everybody mentions. And then Arthur Scargill deliberately got himself arrested so he could be a bit of a martyr. And it lasted a year. And it dominated everything. It's something that I think anybody nowadays, even though strikes have come back on the agenda a bit now, it was of a viciousness that we can't really comprehend now. Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned, I mean, this, as I say, like there's so many good things in this book, but interesting facts to tell other people were one that a quarter of union members voted for her. Was it in 83 or certainly in one of those big elections in the 80s?
I think certainly in 79 and 83, I think it was much more than a quarter, actually. I can't remember the exact figure. I thought it was 40-something percent.
After 1984, they cooled off a little bit.
and then... I mean, if you look back to, I think it was the 1979 election, working class voters, 42% of them voted Conservative. The only Prime Minister to have beaten that, or Conservative Prime Minister to have beaten that, was Boris Johnson in 2019, 47.5%. Now, there are obviously other things at play there, but this idea that it's the Labour Party that is the party of the workers has, since I think 1979, really started to gradually disappear. And the Labour Party has become the party of the sort of metropolitan liberals. And it is, to some degree, the Conservative Party and Robert Halfon, the ex-MP for Harlow, he wanted to rename the Conservative Party the Workers' Party. Well, that was never going to happen. But the thought that people even contemplated that is quite something.
Yeah, because even at the 92 election, one of the things that swung it for the Tories, obviously the Sun, what won it, but was the Mondeo man. Which I think is what I am. I'm essentially Mondeo man, guy that's moved out to the home counties, sort of working class.
I can imagine you drive. What do you drive, Geoff?
Oh, well, currently I drive a turquoise Renault Clio, which is not perhaps the masculine branding I want to send out. Mondeo man in spirit, maybe not in car, but there was a pitch, wasn't there, to the aspirational. I always remember Noel Gallagher said that, the Tories have got nothing for the desperate and Labour have got nothing for the aspirational. That definitely became their brand. Yeah. But, it's interesting you mentioned, how many elections Thatcher won off the back of that massive majority in 79, and then how quickly Boris spurned pretty much everything. Were the 2019 Tories they were never really at ease with the working class vote that they won. It was like having the working class sort of in-laws over for a barbecue, but not really knowing how to talk to them. Is that why Reform will do well? Because they're a bit more at ease and have genuine shared values with that electorate?
I'm not sure that's true. I think if you look at the Tory MPs that were elected in 2019, particularly in the red wall seats, they were generally sort of working class Tories. And I think they brought something very different to Parliament. But the problem was that COVID intervened and effectively they weren't present half the time. And I think they could have had a much bigger influence on the Conservative Party had COVID not happened.
I suppose I mean more kind of like the top brass, the party establishment. They found themselves, it was almost like an inheritance. The same way that Labour won a big election because of the conduct of the other party. The Tories, because of Corbyn and the way that Labour moved towards momentum, they found themselves with this sort of sandbox of working class voters, and they didn't seem to know exactly what to do with it.
Well, it's an interesting theory. I'm not sure that it really works. If you look at the makeup of the Conservative cabinets around that time, you had people like Jacob Rees-Mogg in them, but you also had people who either came from a working class background or were intrinsically working class in a way that maybe that wasn't the case in previous Conservative governments. I mean, David Cameron...
But they didn't sound working class.
Well, do you have to sound like Angela Rayner to be working class?
But there's a lot of people both in politics and in journalism that because of how they sound, people just like people like Andrew Neil, for example. People, amount of times I heard like he was seen as being a very kind of establishment figure. People probably presume that he went to private school.
Yeah, well, people presume I went to private school, but I didn't.
Which school did you go to?
Saffron Walden County High.
Well, that's like private school, isn't it?
No, it's not. It really wasn't.
Best place to live in Britain, apparently.
I know, and I don't live there anymore.
I mean, just continuing these little tidbits of confounding things about Thatcher that people can take away. I mean, I was looking at her record as education minister, and there was a lot of stuff she did there that a Labour politician would have been envious of, right? There was extending the from 16 to 18, she radically expanded that. There was an opening of schools. There was a lot of stuff there that would be seen now probably as quite a sort of social democratic agenda.
She certainly wasn't a right-wing Secretary of State. That is very true. She raised the school leaving age to 16. I mean, that was already in train from the Labour government, but it came in under her. She made more schools comprehensive than any Labour minister did before her or after. And she got a lot of flack within the Conservative Party for doing that. But her view was, I'm not going to be dogmatic about this. If I think that there really is a case for a school remaining a grammar school, then okay, I'll let that happen. But I think it was only about 10% of cases she turned down. So in a way, it's remarkable that she became Tory leader after that record. But it was, I mean, there are all sorts of factors at play. As I say, getting rid of Heath was the main one. But she also, he made her, I think, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury after the October 74 election. And she did a few debates against Dennis Healey, who was Chancellor then, and a real Labour bruiser. And she wiped the floor with him on a couple of occasions. She said, some chancellors are macro chancellors, some chancellors are micro chancellors. This one's just plain cheap. And it was things like that that really got the Tory backbenchers on side. And it all sort of stemmed from there. But one of the myths that I try to explode in the book is that she was some sort of dogmatic conviction politician. She liked to appear as a conviction politician. But in 1975, there was no such thing as Thatcherism. She spent the next few years like a magpie picking up policies from different think tanks or different people like Sir Alfred Sherman, Sir John Hoskins. And so she developed a policy platform. And over her period in office, she was much more pragmatic. I mean, she's famous for the ladies not for turning speech, but actually she didn't go in like a bull in a china shop at virtually anything. She considered things very carefully. And I mean, you look at the first thing that really happened in foreign policy with Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it then was. That was a very pragmatic thing for her government to do. You look at her attitude to Europe in many ways. Again, people think that she would have voted Brexit in 2016 had she still be alive. I doubt it, actually, because she was actually quite pro-European generally. But she developed this reputation as sort of the Iron Lady, which was the best thing the Russians could have ever done to call her that.
Yeah.
And she deployed that image.
We just made you sound like one of the Avengers. Exactly. How are you going to deal with that, huh?
and if you look at her negotiations about getting the budget rebate back with the EEC, I mean, she played the Iron Lady on that Bruce speech in 1988, where she said, we have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in the UK to have them reimposed at a European level. Now, on its own, that sounds like a very Eurosceptic thing to say. But you read the rest of the speech, and it was saying how brilliant the single market was and sort of Europe is really important, blah, blah, blah. So people just look at the surface and the mythology of Thatcher, like on South Africa, without actually looking at the evidence and the proof.